I'm Jamie Jennings. I'm from Island Press. And if you don't know Island Press, we are a DC-based nonprofit book publisher. We focus exclusively on environmental issues. And our goal is to provide the best ideas and information for those seeking to understand and protect the environment and create solutions to complex problems. We publish books on topics ranging from food systems, water, health, ecosystems, and conservation to designing livable cities. We then bring those ideas to life through events like this, putting, from workshops, webinars, outreach, events, the idea is to put our authors and their ideas in the hands of people who can actually bring them to life. So first I want to introduce Dan Imhoff. And he has written several books about ecology, sustainability, and the Farm Bill for over 25 years, thus making him an expert on this essential piece of legislation. His newest book is The Farm Bill, A Citizen's Guide. The second person I'm going to introduce is Michael Lavender, who is the Senior Manager of Government Affairs for the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Food and Environment Program, where he advocates for healthy, sustainable, and socially equitable food systems. And then we have Christina Badaracco, which I think I messed up, a registered dietitian who is working to improve access to healthy and sustainable food and educate Americans about the connections between food and health. Previously, she has done clinical nutrition research at the National Institutes of Health and communications at the EPA's Office of Water. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to talk about the Farm Bill.
Good afternoon. If I can just ask a few quick questions. How many of you feel like you have a good understanding of the Farm Bill? And how many would really appreciate just kind of a bullet point introduction to what this big legislation is? Okay, great. How many are from commodity state districts where you have corn, cotton, wheat, rice, soybeans, peanuts? Okay, and how many are in coastal or more urban areas and where food stamps are very important? Okay. Well, it's really amazing to see all you people here. I don't know if you want to squeeze in or
Yeah,
there's some room back here, up here.
And I can tell you that it's very daunting when someone says that you're an expert on a legislation like the Farm Bill, which is really unbelievably massive and complex and ever-changing. But I was in a conference many years ago, and as an author, I'm always looking for intervention points that can really move change in important directions. And I was at a conference. I had a pretty good understanding of conservation programs through the Farm Bill on the ground, having written a book many years ago called Farming with the Wild, where I really went all over the country trying to find the best examples of our government investing in conservation in agricultural regions. But I was at this conference, and it was in 2006. We were gearing up for what was then supposed to be the 2007 Farm Bill, and I heard this all-day conference of issues about international trade and rural development and the plight of family farmers, overweight and diabetes, nutritional crises, and it went on and on and on, and the language was so incredibly complex that I thought, wow, this is like the most important legislation no one's ever heard of, and how could you understand it, because all you're hearing are these crazy acronyms and highly technical language. So I very naively decided that I was going to be a translator of the Farm Bill for the average person. And I wrote the first edition of Food Fight, and the reauthorization went from 2006 into 2007, and it became the 2008 Farm Bill. And I made many, many talks during that year. And the idea was, do we have a copy of the book here? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could somebody hold it up, whoever has it? Yeah. Anyway, the idea was, let's take this really, really complex legislation and try to make it understandable for the average person. There's a copy of the book there. And with graphs that are easy to understand and took the time to kind of crack the code. At the time, Nancy Pelosi said, the Farm Bill used to be one of the legislations I knew the least about. Now I know more about it than more than I ever would have liked to know about it. And which shows you just really how many issues are related to it. In big broad strokes, every 5 to 7 years, Congress and the Senate agriculture committees hash out a plan that spends about $1 trillion over a 10-year period on food assistance, crop subsidies, just supports for agriculture, and conservation are the three main categories. And if you took a dollar bill in today's terms, and that dollar bill represented the Farm Bill budget, about 75 cents out of the bill would be for the SNAP program and for nutrition assistance programs. So right now, the overwhelming majority of the money goes towards nutrition assistance. That's not understandable because the next big, that's not surprising because the next big category is about 20 cents of the bill, and it goes for farm supports. And most of that money goes to farm supports with a very, very narrow number of crops and in a very number of congressional districts. And to a very number of farming operations that are getting bigger all the time because of the way a lot of these subsidies are structured. And that leaves 5 cents for conservation and important research programs and trade assistance and things like that. And I'm here as a taxpayer. I come from California. California is the largest producing agricultural state, produces about 12% of all the agricultural output in the United States, and it gets less than 5% of the agriculture supports. So where I live, my wife and I live in Northern California. We're in a very agricultural region. Wine and wine grapes are the largest, recognized agricultural output. There's another sector that is becoming legalized that's even bigger than wine grapes. And then we have dairy crops, but we get very few crop supports at all from the Farm Bill. But we're also in areas where we have lots of impact of agriculture on our rivers and on our natural systems. And I would argue that we actually deserve a lot more just because we're paying taxes, we're putting economic output into this big sector. And the Farm Bill really should be there to pay for things that the market doesn't pay for. These things that are public goods, like clean water and beauty and open space, extra incentives to make sure that soil is protected and is fertilized without overuse of chemicals and toxins that are tragically overwhelming most of our agricultural areas all over the country. I go back to the origins of the bill, and I think if you have any time at all to study a little bit about the origins of the Farm Bill, it's actually kind of exciting, which is an amazing thing to hear myself say. But you know, the soil was literally blowing away in the Great Depression, and farmers had been trying to keep up with an industrializing economy for many decades, and so they were planting, and they were planting into areas that they never probably should have planted. And the more they planted, the lower the price fell because there was an oversupply. And that was really their only technique, really their only mechanism to get ahead. And Then came this searing drought and floods and created the catastrophic conditions that were the Dust Bowl. At the same time, about 1/3 of Americans were out of work. And so there was a lot of underemployment and a lot of nutrition, hunger and starving on the streets. And the government, came in and said, we have a duty here to protect our farmers, to make sure they have credit, and to somehow put the brakes on oversupply. Because at a certain point in the 1930s, the price of corn, there was such oversupply, the price of corn went to zero. So farmers were in desperate straits. And yet we had starving people, even though we had an oversupply of food. So the government really got in 1933 to the early programs, and they began to say, let's try to address this oversupply problem. And their first attempts to do that were to give credit and to begin to give assistance to farmers and make a tax on processed food. And that was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So they came up with another idea a few years later, which was if you get subsidies from the government, if you get capital credit loans, then you have to enroll in a conservation program. And the conservation program began to address problems with the Dust Bowl. It began to use biological means of protecting soil, creating habitat, and also by taking land out of production, it stopped oversupply. It decreased supply a bit. The reason I'm telling you this is that there was a social contract involved, right? In the 1930s, even though there were a lot more open talks about socialism and communism, it was considered completely inappropriate to give a private person money from the government with nothing in return. So they entered into these conservation programs, and the conservation programs did a few things. It helped the farmers with their oversupply problem, and it also helped us by protecting our most valuable resource, the soil and water in agricultural regions. Now, if we fast forward to where we are today, we have conservation programs, but we've completely lost this social contract. Right now, most of our commodity programs support oversupply. Oversupply really helps the people who benefit from buying those raw ingredients of oversupply, like grain traders and processed food manufacturers and anybody who makes things from manufactured food. And we've really lost that social contract. I would argue that it's more important than ever in this age of global warming, in really uncertain agricultural conditions, that we begin to put a lot more money into conserving the soil, into new ways of farming that can sequester carbon, with permanent types of cropping systems that take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground. But it's going to take a whole new generation of farming and research and people on the ground to make this happen. At $100 billion a year, this is not small money. This is all real money. Every bit of it counts. And Mike Lavender is going to talk about a lot of programs that we've recently made progress on. But I think my main message is that the Farm Bill that just passed was a preservation of the status quo. And the status quo was unacceptable in 2002 and in 2008 and in 2014. It was even more unacceptable in 2018 in the bill that just passed. And really, as we look ahead, we have to see this Farm Bill as an extremely important legislation that shouldn't be ignored by anyone, whether you're in a commodity producing district or not. And that it can be the engine for revitalization in rural areas, for new programs that help us as a country eat healthier and that really address these big problems of climate change and global warming that are coming our way. I thank the offices of Earl Blumenauer. I've had the great chance to speak with him a few times about this issue. I applaud his decision to vote no on the last Farm Bill. I thought it was a completely unacceptable bill that should have gone back to the drawing board. And also to the Jared Huffman's office. He's my congressional district. And it's great to see you all here. And we'll have some more questions later. Thank you.
Hey everyone, and thanks, Dan. My name is Mike Lavender. I'm the Senior Manager of Government Affairs for the Union of Concerned Scientists Food and Environment Program here in Washington, D.C. For those of you who may not have had a chance to work with us yet, UCS is a national nonprofit. We have about 100 people based here in D.C. and 200 nationally, and we believe fundamentally that science and fact-based decision-making needs to inform federal policy if we're going to produce federal policy that benefits our country, our environment, and the vast majority of people in this country. I want to start off with something that Dan kind of touched on throughout. And I'm from the Midwest, and so maybe we can break a few stereotypes right off the start with, of course, the guy from the Midwest cares about food and farm. Do any one of you think the district that you represent or that you work for isn't impacted by the Farm Bill? Or could you describe the district that you think isn't impacted by the Farm Bill? That's great. That makes my life easier. So, as Dan was describing, if you have a river or a stream running through your district, you're impacted by the Farm Bill. If you have grocery stores, if you have farmers markets, if you have rural pockets, even without farming, you're impacted by the Farm Bill. If you are somehow involved in the energy sector, you are impacted by the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill has 12 titles, and they are wide-ranging. So your district, your constituency, in one way or another, is impacted by the Farm Bill. And I think one of the main things that I want to leave with you is that we need more people to engage and look at the Farm Bill as a serious piece of legislation that has an impact across this country. So with the UCS Food and Environment Program, I want to highlight several things from the 2018 Farm Bill that we considered wins in the bill that I think many of you, if you were reading the Morning Ag Digest or reading the news stories, you would have seen come across your radar. So bear with me for these three. The Local Agriculture Market Program, otherwise known as LAMP. For you Anchorman fans, we love LAMP. LAMP is a program that combines a couple of pre-existing programs which actually helps farmers better connect with new markets in rural and urban areas in order for those farmers to sell their products to those markets. Also, at the same time, giving those markets products to buy. In many cases, in many parts of the country, rural or urban areas, there simply isn't enough product to feed enough people. The LAMP program received $60 million in mandatory baseline funding. $60 million isn't a lot of money, but it was a crucial win to continue making these connections, particularly at a time when so many across rural America are struggling to find jobs or struggling to support their families. So the Local Agriculture Market Program, or LAMP. Another key win, again from UCS's standpoint, was maintaining and preserving the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as SNAP. This was one of the bigger stories in the 2018 Farm Bill. There were a number of proposals included in the House bill that would have, by our estimation, gutted the program, would have removed millions of people from participating in the program, would have directly increased hunger and poverty for those people and for their families. And actually, what isn't very well known is even though SNAP is a food assistance program, right? It provides nutrition to families and individuals in need. It also has an outsized economic impact on communities that it's a part of. So the benefits of SNAP don't just stop with the meal that someone's able to afford because of its support. The economic ramifications of SNAP being used in a community are actually felt throughout the community. So thankfully, we were able to, in coalition with a number of folks on the Hill and folks throughout the community, were able to protect the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program from significant attacks and reducing enrollment unnecessarily. And then finally, one of the other major wins that we see in this Farm Bill was, as Dan was saying, on the conservation side. There were a number of reforms that were included in the conservation title, which is Title II of the Farm Bill, that increase incentives for what science tells us can help reduce soil erosion, can help improve soil quality, which can help benefit farmers, and can, yes, even sequester carbon. So those were included in the Farm Bill as well. Now, all of these are good things. All of these are important. A lot of people, including myself and many folks in this room, worked for years to get those wins. And they will help real people and they will help the environment. But I want to pose the question, kind of getting to what Dan was talking about status quo. I want to pose the question, why aren't some of the bigger wins that we got bigger? Why can't we do better? The things that I described are all great things. They're going to help people. But I think if you ask many people, including Dan, including myself, they could be perceived as table scraps. In a bill that costs nearly $1 trillion over the lifetime of the bill, a $60 million program, as great as it is, isn't representative of the fact that the Farm Bill as it's structured needs to change in order to support everyone in this country. We want, at UCS, we want a food and farm system that works for everyone. We don't want to leave people out in the cold. We don't want to leave family farmers out in the cold, small farmers, folks who are hungry. Everyone should be supported through a Farm Bill. So the simple fact that we agree that this was another status quo Farm Bill, even though there were some good things in there, that tells you that the structural integrity of the Farm Bill has been entrenched for a long time. And I think Dan put that very eloquently and he described some of the trajectory of why that is the way it is. There needs to be a structural shift in the Farm Bill if we're going to see some of the change that we all want to see in our communities, whether for hungry individuals and their families, for our environment, or for our farmers. Because I can tell you right now, the myth that we all have in the American psyche, that struggling family farmer that's putting food on the table for their family and helping their neighbors, that is rapidly fading out of existence. The average age of the farmer is 65, white male, 65 plus, maybe 68. We need to bring a new generation of farmers into the farming community across this country. And so a lot of work needs to be done. Some money was actually put into that too, beginning in socially disadvantaged farmers in the Farm Bill. Very important work. But again, when you're looking at the overall cost of the Farm Bill, it was a relative fraction of what we actually need to be investing if we're going to see a food and agriculture system in this country that works for more than just a select few. So I want to close here by talking about, as we look over the next few years, we know it's going to be a busy couple of years here in the House. I'm sure you guys are very busy already. But from UCS's perspective, I really wanted to talk about where we see the opportunity over the next couple of years, one of the opportunities, I should say, to really make some significant structural change. You all read the news. There's a lot of conversation around climate right now. There's a lot of conversation around what climate solutions can be proposed. And agriculture is a part of this. So what the science tells us is that if you think of a plot of farmland, you think of corn or soybeans on that land, what we know is that if you can keep green on the field for more of the year, so right, instead of just harvesting in October and leaving it bare again until the next spring when you plant, if you can keep green on the field for more of the year, whether that's cover crops, perennials that can survive the winter, or some other method, that can improve soil quality. It can reduce erosion, which improves water quality, and it can even sequester carbon. So part of the solution that we're looking at is how do we keep green on the field for more of the year? It's what we call our healthy soils work. One of the great things about it is that there isn't just one benefit, right? There are environmental benefits to what we're talking about, and I just described a couple of them. But the beauty of it is that they can also benefit farmers. In these conversations around climate and agriculture, it's a non-starter if you're talking about something that can't support a farmer as well. These people are trying to feed their families, they're trying to support their communities. So if we can find ways, and we think that they're there, to support sustainable agricultural practices that not only are good for the environment, but they can provide farmers a solid bottom line to support them and their families. And so over the next few years, you're going to hear more about this. You're probably going to attend more briefings like this that are talking about these types of solutions. And what I would ask of you is to start talking about this with your boss. Start talking about this with your staff. Look into your district. See what different types of agriculture is in your district, because the conversation is already going around how does agriculture plug into the climate solution? What are some of these solutions that could work for everyone? And so we at UCS, along with Congressman Blumenauer's office, Congressman Huffman's office, and a number of others, we're all thinking in this general space. And so I think what is really critical is that in the past, people have looked at agriculture and said, well, I'm not on the ag committee. I don't have 50 million acres of corn or soy in my district, so why would I care about the Farm Bill? And that's what we need to break through. Everyone is impacted by the Farm Bill, and we have opportunity for structural change into the future. So we're going to have that conversation over the next couple of years. So I think I'll wrap up with that. I'm happy to answer questions. I don't know who's up next, but thank you.
Hi everyone, again my name is Christina Badaracco. I'm excited to be here with you all today, and I've had the pleasure of working with Dan on this book over the last couple of years. So as Jamie mentioned, I am a dietitian with a background and passion for public health and helping all Americans to be able to eat better food, and the Farm Bill is really fundamental in driving the way Americans eat. Those of us who might be middle income as well as those who are low income and on the SNAP program. So I'd like to just share a few concluding thoughts, I guess, about how the Farm Bill can better promote nutrition in both of those spaces. So starting with the SNAP program in particular, again, one of the 12 titles in the Farm Bill is called the nutrition title, and most of that funding today goes toward SNAP, somewhere between about 75 and 80% of the Farm Bill. So that is the primary nutrition assistance for low-income Americans, and it provides benefits on essentially a debit card that folks can use to buy groceries. And there have been some small programs in the Farm Bill that provide incentives for recipients to buy healthier food, for example, at farmers markets, to buy fruits and vegetables. So I think we've seen some small incremental progress over the last decade or two. But looking at the much bigger picture, research has shown recently that, sadly enough, SNAP participants in the US have diets that contain less healthy food, and they have actually worse health outcomes, higher rates of disease, death, morbidity than people of the same income level but who are not in the program. So that means if you're participating in the SNAP program, you actually have higher rates of disease and you are buying more unhealthy groceries. And to me, that's really upsetting when we think about some Americans who are really vulnerable and really struggling to be able to put food on the table. And so I think we need to think much more seriously about how to actually make sure SNAP is promoting nutrition, since it is the biggest piece of that nutrition title. And there's some great work coming out of Tufts and elsewhere that shows that doing more work with perhaps incentives, some disincentives for unhealthy things like soda and other things might be able to move that forward. But I think we need to think about more how we can better research ways to make sure SNAP is being used effectively and promoting good health outcomes. So I think in the next version of the Farm Bill, and hopefully even before then, we'll be able to think much more seriously about how to improve health outcomes. And then generally speaking, through the Farm Bill, the way we make certain types of food cheaper, more affordable, that makes other types of food, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes, the things that should really be the basis of our plate. According to certain offices within USDA, those things are much more expensive for all of us. And so it's much easier to be able to afford processed foods, shelf-stable foods, refined carbohydrates, white rice, pasta, those sorts of things. Meat is made very cheap when corn and soy are very cheap because they're fed to animals. But those things are really just supposed to be a very small piece on our plate. And if you're interested, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine has a really great graphic that shows how our agricultural subsidies in the US make food on an average plate really affordable. So meat taking up a huge chunk, sugar, refined carbohydrates taking up a huge chunk, and then fruits and vegetables maybe less than 1% each, whereas USDA's My Plate says fruits and vegetables should be half of our plate. But that's not really the way the Farm Bill is directing the American diet in this day and age. So that's something I'm really excited about trying to move forward in my work, and I'm hoping that that's something you all are excited about working on with your congressmen and your colleagues and you as consumers too, because there's a lot you can do as consumers in the U.S. too. So I'd appreciate any other questions you might have related to nutrition and healthcare as well. So thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to let Kevin take quick notes before we enter into Q&A.
Yeah, real quick. So I'm going to pass these around, but it's very Portland of my boss. I'm representing Portland, Oregon. He wrote a little comic book on what the Farm Bill means. I see folks taking notes. These actually do have pretty up-to-date stats. It was written for the last Farm Bill, but as Dan noted, it's very status quo. So while we do Q&A, I'm going to pass this around to people. We have a ton more in my office. And if you look on the floor, you'll probably see Earl with his bike and his bow tie waving this in your boss's face. So anyway, I'm going to pass this around. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, Dan, you ready for Q&A?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
please.
And questions?
Before we start, I will make a plug for Island Press and the book. Hopefully it can make the rounds. You can pass a copy of the book around. Please get it in your office and read it. We've tried really, really hard to make this very important, essential, complex topic understandable for everybody. So, questions?
For Dan, anyone else?
Yes.
So a few of you made reference to the next Farm Bill is not going to be for 5 years, but there are possibly some things that we can work on in the next couple of years. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate on more specifics about what you think should be done before the next Farm Bill comes around, what opportunities there are, before a structural change can be made to the Farm Bill.
I'll start and then I'll pass this on. Actually, the Farm Bill kind of has, there's a sort of a mini Farm Bill that's passed every year in the appropriations process. So some of the programs are guaranteed; they have mandatory funding, and others are discretionary, so they get hashed out in the annual budgeting appropriations process. And for people who really care about certain programs that aren't guaranteed, you have to fight to make sure that their funding is going to, go through. And then there's an overall trend in conservation funding where if there's some other need, let's say you have to increase the SNAP program, or there's emergency disaster payments because certain sectors of the farming area were hit by flood or by drought or market prices, then oftentimes the conservation budget is raided in order to take money to put into other places. And so, for me, conservation and nutrition are the sacred programs because it's very hard to look at the current structure of the commodity supports and say that they're really a safety net. They really seem to be an engine that is driving overproduction and consolidation, and it's really supporting the bigger growers and not really a true family farm safety net. And I would say, as you look forward, I think it's really important to see what just happened in this last bill, and that is that there were some very outrageous proposals on the table, and that was to increase work requirements for SNAP. It was to make some certain pesticides, deregulate certain very, very toxic chemicals because they were considered essential in agriculture, to deregulate forestry in the West. These were never serious proposals at all, but it gave the appearance that they were big gains when they didn't appear in the final bill. But what did appear in the final bill were new expanded loopholes in who is eligible to receive commodity payments. Not just a husband and wife, but their children, their spouses, their nieces, their nephews. What Environmental Working Group has described the 23andMe law. Basically, any genetic ancestor that's related to a farming operation is now eligible for up to $125,000 in crop supports. What this does is create a financial mechanism for the bigger operations to get bigger, rather than to really serve as a safety net that works to preserve a family farming rural culture. So I would say one of the big fights really in the next 5 years is in this income eligibility requirement. It really has to return to a farm safety net rather than some economic financial engine that makes the small bigger, the big bigger and the small go out of business. Yeah, that's what I would say there.
Can I point out one thing with that too? Even though the Farm Bill is passed every 5 years and there's an appropriations bill every year that has changes in mandatory program spending called CHIMPs, and that's what Dan was talking to, we're even changing some of these rules right now. In the disaster supplemental bill that we passed 2 weeks ago, there was actually a provision in that got rid of the payment limit for certain trade aid funding programs from the president. And so now, any farmer that makes over $900,000 in adjusted gross income, that's the money they make after all their expenditures and everything like that, means they have an overall profit of that much after spending within that year, can still get trade aid dollars. So these are battles that are being fought time and time again, and they're very complicated, and I think that's why a lot of times it's very easy to kind of look the other way or not be informed about them, but it is happening on a day-to-day basis, and the fight for food is not something that just occurs in 5 years.
I'd like my co-panelists to respond as well.
You know, so there are these moments every year, disaster supplemental, when obviously their riders are attached to things, and that's something we all need to be aware of. The agriculture community in farm bills historically, they have been hesitant to have a robust farm policy conversation outside of a farm bill. So for the most part, aside from appropriations and aside from odd riders here and there, these broader policy conversations are restricted to the farm bill, which is why, to your question, this idea about changing the structure, this may sound simple, but I think it's true. I think it really is about bringing more members, more of your bosses, into the fold and understanding of the minutia of the farm bill and getting people up to speed. I feel like Kevin and I have had this conversation a number of times where we're just saying, if there was only a little bit more interest from members, if there was only a few more folks who were interested in going down to the floor to speak on this topic, if there was only a few more people who could offer an amendment, that's what we need. That education curve, that greater buy-in from members of Congress into these issues is really important to the structural change. Because I'll tell you, from a factual standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, there is a ton of data that supports making structural changes for the betterment of all, including farmers. And so we're really at a point where we need to broaden the base. And I think that's, for us, that's what part of what these next 2 to 3 years are about.
Yeah, I just have, I guess, a couple small things to add to that. So to reiterate Mike's point, last night I was actually volunteering in an event called Sips and Suppers. If any of you know DC Central Kitchen and Martha's Table. It's a big volunteer event that helps to raise money for those wonderful organizations every year. And I was volunteering along with a young woman who works in Congressman Coon's office from the state of Delaware. And she works a lot on agriculture policy. We were chatting on the Farm Bill in the car on the way over. And I was asking her something Dan and I have been talking about. Given the change in the House this year, why was there such a rush to pass the Farm Bill as it was in the fall rather than kind of trying again this year? And that was something she was able to tell me pretty simply, that she thought her congressman and some others, certainly Blumenauer and others, were very concerned with what was in the bill as it was. But a lot of congressmen were kind of fearful about leaving things up in the air for their farmer constituents in their states, and so they just wanted to get something passed before the end of the calendar year. But overall, she felt like most congressmen just didn't know a lot of the details about the Farm Bill and didn't know some of these priorities we've been talking about. And so she, from her perspective, it seemed like folks were, again, just eager to kind of get it passed. And move forward without really knowing a lot of the problems that would continue and the lost opportunity to really make progress moving forward. So I definitely reiterate what Mike was just saying. And then finally, again, just as we go through the annual appropriations process, there are certainly a lot of the small programs that support farmers markets, that support value-added producers grants and other things. And the most recent Farm Bill did make some of these have mandatory funding, but it's really important to make sure that each year through appropriations, these small but mighty programs that are actually supporting small, local, sustainable producers promoting good quality, nutritious food. It's important that their funding not get cut each year. And the small amount of funding we do have for research to move forward, nutrition in the SNAP program and a new really exciting produce prescription program, it's really important to make sure that those continue to whatever extent they can before the next Farm Bill is passed.
I have a question. I guess I could direct to whoever can answer the best. In your opinion, what are the effects to the farm workers in regards to health and work compensations, if that ties into it? How are they affected? Farm workers.
Well, there is no labor title for the Farm Bill. So, you know, and in our state of California, we have a few really huge problems that there is no Farm Bill program to address. One is housing, an incredible shortage of housing. And also, as you're saying, the impact of toxicology of being a farm worker, being exposed to, you know, really, really difficult working conditions and harmful chemicals, and not being paid adequately. So it's very ironic that in California, where we're producing an enormous amount of the state's fresh fruits and vegetables, that the people who are doing the work can't even afford it. They can't get good sources of water, adequate housing, and a lot of them are on nutrition assistance. And a lot of the people who actually work in the food industry in general can't even afford to eat well. So a labor title would be quite an important addition to the Farm Bill to begin to address these issues. That's from my standpoint anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's a paradox that some of the people who are impacted most by it aren't explicitly included in the bill. And I think that is part of a broader theme, actually, when you look at farm legislation, that historically underserved, socially disadvantaged communities of color are really underrepresented in the Farm Bill at large, and that's partially reflected through farm workers. We work closely with a group based in Chicago called the Food Chain Workers Alliance, who represents a lot of individuals throughout the supply chain. I don't know if there's any simple solution, but suffice to say that they are greatly impacted, and we'd love to talk more about things we can do.
Thank you.
I was wondering if, this is going to change depending on which part of everything we're talking about today we're discussing, but any programs in other countries, old or new, that provide a pretty good, like a bit of idea for if you could draw enough parallel to the situation in the U.S. versus another country, someone who's doing it better than we are.
I have two broad brush answers to that. One is there has been, the European Union has kind of a farm bill, a European farm bill, and they have, over the years, increasingly tried to move toward green payments only. So getting away from supports for overproduction, production supports, to really paying landowners and helping in cost share programs and other supports to farm differently, to increase habitat and perennial structure all throughout farmland. So I think Europe is trying to move toward a green payments only subsidy program, which I completely endorse. I really feel like the money should be there for things that the market doesn't pay for, and we all benefit from stewardship, better stewardship, especially when it's enlightened stewardship. In the 1980s, there's another example. In the mid-1980s, New Zealand had a very liberal government, and they had an incredible balance of payments economic problem. And they had been going down the agricultural support program that we were in the United States. And basically they were just throwing money at farmers, trying to get rid of this this perennial problem of overproduction, low prices, so the farmers were continually falling behind, but the money really wasn't making a difference. And so they were looking at it economically, and the farmers themselves decided, for the good of the country, for the good of the economy, we have to stop the subsidy program. And so in 1985, New Zealand went cold turkey from farm subsidies. And now they've had two successive generations of farmers who they don't even know what agriculture subsidies are. Now I think you can argue that New Zealand, they diversified. About less than 10% of their farmers went out of business when they stopped the subsidy program. But they also kind of incentivized this whole new change in agriculture in New Zealand. They started a wine industry. They started a really robust apple and other kiwis and other fruits, and a bigger dairy industry. I think now, 30 years later, you can look at the program and say, well, they kind of went overboard on free market expansion of the agriculture sector, and they could have used some government intervention in some programs to actually incentivize conservation a lot better. And I think they're starting to feel the impacts of too highly concentrated dairy operations and things like this. So yeah, I would say this structural change to me has to come from the farmers themselves. They have to realize that they're going to be the change. They're going to be the change on the ground. And if it's really just an economic decision, then I think it's up to our policymakers and the farmers to figure out how can it work both ways. How can we pay them to really sequester carbon, to have green on the fields a lot more, to produce a lot more healthy food, without financing this big industrial consolidated agriculture that we have right now. So sorry for the long answer.
And I'll just say real quick that before we even look internationally, let's look at what the states are doing. If you're thinking in the mold of healthy soils and that climate agriculture nexus, we are getting ready to publish some results of some research we've done over the past few months. There are over 200 bills that have either been introduced or adopted in state legislatures across the country, in California, but also in the middle of the country as well, the Dakotas, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, that are explicitly looking at how can we encourage farmers to adopt sustainable agriculture practices for these multiple benefits. So I'd actually say, I'm sure there are international examples, but I actually think there are probably a lot of good examples from your states that the state legislature has looked at or at least introduced that are interesting models as we continue along the conversation to what's the broader solution nationally. And I know Hawaii's had some as well, a bit of leader there, Maryland. Those are the two that are going to mind.
How are people going to find out? How do they find out about your report when it comes out?
Come grab my business card, or I'll just blast it to the hill. Yeah, but come grab my business card.
Be on the lookout for.
Yeah, if you guys are interested in learning more about this, and we're planning on doing other working group meetings, other conversations at a staff level, so please make sure to fill out kind of the sheets that you got in front of us. We'll make sure we'll contact everyone.
There was one over here, yeah.
How is the new Farm Bill going to help or affect the new United States, Mexico, Canada agreement?
I really don't know. I'm kind of waiting for that agreement to be finalized.
I think
My-
it's agriculture.
My boss is actually going to be chair of the trade subcommittee, so we'll be looking over that, and
Okay.
we're going to be holding a number of hearings to kind of take a look at that
Okay.
and the impacts that the president's tariffs have also had, on that agreement and on the broader agriculture.
Dan, are there any specific things that you know of coming out from Sacramento that will probably move and shake the country? instance, so many things that come out of Sacramento, they're the trendsetter.
Yeah.
They influence policy across the country. For
Yeah,
example,
I mean,
business management came out of Sacramento.
I think that there is a really broad link in the state between climate change and agriculture, and investing in new incentive programs to have a more climate resilient agriculture. And I imagine that there's also moves underway to really use dollars for rural development and rural revitalization. Water is always a really big issue in our state, and water allocations are kind of trade-offs between agriculture, health of fish and wildlife, and urban areas. And probably, given the way climate is affecting agriculture in California, just in California in general, our state is literally burning up and will probably continue to burn up for many years. I think that we're going to have a lot different regulations on water use, groundwater use, and that's going to affect agriculture as well, deeply. But, you know, some of my good friends are working in Sacramento all the time, and I do agree with you that there, you know, if with dysfunction at the national level, in terms of, you know, the outcome of the farm bill that we have, then states really do have to take the lead. And agriculture is such an important driver for California's economy that they have no choice but to do that. At the same time, we also have a pretty big climate legislation and cap and trade and monies available that are there to invest in changes. And then finally, I would say there is a policy on the table to tax soda, a 2 cent per ounce soda tax, and it's getting a lot of support amongst the medical community, public health officials, and the idea would be it would generate over $1 billion a year that could be used not just for education on nutrition and treatment, but to incentivize sustainable agriculture and getting healthy foods, more affordable healthy foods to lower income communities, and support family farms in the process. So I think that might be the most innovative idea that I've heard so far.
In terms of improving the nutritional outcomes for SNAP recipients, is there, like, specifically with the Farm Bill, is there like a big conversation or a big policy that's getting floated around? Is it like changes to subsidies, or is there something else that's kind of become popular?
So within the Farm Bill itself, I'm not really aware of any discussions like that. Within the public health community, within like researchers and academia, there are absolutely folks thinking about how to make these changes. There's a big debate, and has been for years, about adding in restrictions. So even going beyond a tax, as Dan was mentioning, actually restricting food. So if any of you are familiar with the WIC program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance for Women, Infants, and Children, not funded through the Farm Bill, but it's our second largest federal nutrition assistance program for low-income women who are pregnant or postpartum and their young children. And that is a program that is much more narrow than SNAP, in that it gives a very, very prescribed diet. I've actually counseled women in WIC for a few months last year while I was living in Boston, and I'm very familiar with the fact that I load certain benefits so that they can buy a dozen eggs per month. They can buy 1 pound of like 2 different types of cheese per month. It's very specific. And so some folks are saying, should we restrict SNAP to the same point where people can get these exact foods? But there are some issues with that. First of all, that would provide a bureaucratic nightmare, figuring out how do we restrict what vendors are selling what who are already accepting these debit cards. Also, people who are on the SNAP program are all different shapes, sizes, colors, ages, and have very different nutritional needs. They might have different disease states, so that makes it really hard to figure out for these people what is actually healthy versus not. As I mentioned before, there's some suggestions about maybe doing more like an incentive program for fruits and vegetables, with which farmers markets currently have, maybe expanding that to grocery stores and others, while also doing disincentives. So kind of like the idea of a soda tax for unhealthy food in grocery stores. And doing more with the SNAP education program, which does receive a little bit of funding. So there are some ideas on a small scale like that, but for the most part, I'd say those are more being tossed around in the kind of academia, public health world, and not so much right here in Congress.
Two quick things that I'd mention. The dietary guidelines for 2020-2025, that process, those guidelines won't even be finalized for another year and a half, but the federal process to kick it off has already started. We're expecting USDA to announce the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, now that the government is open, any day now. That'll be about 20 members, and the dietary guidelines are important because they kind of undergird federal nutrition programs with recommendations about content. But also this year, the guidelines are expanding from 0 to 24 months, from birth to 24 months. So we're including recommendations for an extra 2 years. So it's really crucial that we get those right for a number of obvious reasons. That and child nutrition reauthorization, there is, I think it's still kind of up in the air. There is a small potential that could be reopened again within the next couple of years, ahead of 2020. If you'll remember, Congress never actually finished it in 2015 before they kind of kicked up Farm Bill talk. So those are two things to keep an eye on.
And the guidelines, do those just instruct the educational programs that Christina was talking about?
A number of them do. They also put together, they inform My Plate. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so they will be part of kind of the government's education. I can also speak from the perspective of a registered dietitian who's been through the sort of clinical training and knows very well when patients come into a hospital, come into an outpatient clinic, these are the things that end up on the handouts that we give to patients. And essentially, we're kind of governed by the National Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which works very closely with USDA. And so there are, I'm sure, kind of small scale private practices that kind of do their own thing and branch off, but for the most part, the field of dietitians in the U.S. are essentially promoting what's in the dietary guidelines. So that's getting out to all Americans across the lifespan.
I know you guys mentioned how the bill was basically a preservation of the status quo, but what are some of the biggest reforms from the last one to this one?
From the 2014 bill to the 2018 bill?
Yeah, nieces and nephews can get farm subsidies now.
I mean, I don't think there were many, and I'm not being hyperbolic. There are changes, and so don't quote me on the fact that there are changes that are going to impact people's lives, but when we're talking about the big structural change that is going to be pervasive, I think it's relatively limited. I don't know, anybody catch me if I'm missing something. We don't work in every single title of the Farm Bill. There are 12.
Well, I can say that I made a talk many years ago, first Farm Bill book, Food Fight, and it was in Connecticut with a group called Wholesome Wave was just beginning their work, and that was co-founded by a chef named Michel Nichon, very interested in nutrition assistance. And I showed the slide that was how the Farm Bill money gets divvied up. And at the time, it was pre-crisis, pre the financial crisis of 2008, so it was actually just about 50 cents of the dollar went to SNAP. And much more was going to commodity supports at the time because the money was just going out the door for corn subsidies. At any rate, those guys in that room credit looking at that slide and saying they were really going to target SNAP to try to get healthy food into the more needy communities in the United States. And now there's a program called FINI, F-I-N-I, the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program. And it's really, I think Christina mentioned that it's part of it is to help people double their purchasing power of fresh fruits and vegetables from certain vendors. And they now have made that a mandatory permanent funding. And so that's the kind of thing, and Wholesome Wave credits the book with, that's how they started, and now it's permanently funded. And so, yes, you can have an idea, turn it into policy, work it through a couple bills, and so one of their big victories they feel is permanent protection for those monies. Another thing that changed is now hemp is considered an official commodity crop in the United States after being vilified for, about 80 years. And I think, there's a lot of farmers that used to grow tobacco that were looking for another crop that could potentially be a commodity in rotation and just an affordable crop. Amazingly, it came out of Tennessee. That the big champion for that was Mitch McConnell, or Kentucky, sorry. But Tennessee, Kentucky, those areas of the country are really looking to expand their growth of and non-THC hemp. And so, yeah, that was another big victory in this otherwise status quo bill.
My boss is one of the only Democrats to vote against it, but I will say he has fought for a long time to he wants to double conservation funding overall, but some of the smaller changes is make it work so that the existing programs spend money on things that actually make improvements and aren't just wasteful, like just building fences for big capos, or building manure lagoons they're gonna build anyway. And there were some really good changes to some of the conservation programs, the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Qualities Incentive Program. You'll hear those later as CSP EQIP. That put more of that money towards protecting drinking water. So he felt like that was a big win. There was also a really cool pilot program to study improve soil health. And while it didn't mention the words climate change or carbon dioxide, the underlying incentive of why we tried to put that program into the bill, and this was done by Senator Wyden on the Senate side, was to study how soil and improve the way that soil can actually sequester carbon, because when you have very healthy, high quality soil, it actually takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that's otherwise been emitted from tilling the soil again and again. So there are some really cool things in there, and things that my boss has been fighting for and championing for a while. I think it shows that when you do kind of get nerdy on these things and your boss really cares about it and goes to the floor and lays around a comic book, you can actually, fight for some of the smaller things. But, I think to our point, with a bill that is, over $900 billion over 10 years, there is so much potential for change and for its impact on the economy, on the environment, and on the way that people eat and live their lives. And there's so much more we can do there.
So I would say definitely watch what's coming out of the Blumenauer shop as you're thinking about policies for these next 5 years, because I do see a lot of smart thinking, strategic thinking that needs more support.
Maybe one more.
So I just wanted to see what you guys thought, because you keep bringing up you want to see changes. Like, what are those changes you wish to see? You want members to be more involved. But is that more of a nature of the bill itself, that it's every 5 years? Like the NDA comes up every year, appropriations come up every year, members have to think about them constantly. So the Farm Bill, which could be 5 or 7 years from now, and some of these members might not even be here.
Right.
So so how do we then get them involved and educated to kind of that level that we're proposing?
Well, I think we've talked about, that's a great question, and I don't think anybody has the silver bullet answer. But I think we have maybe informally kicked around the idea of what is a food caucus or a food and agriculture progressive caucus, some sort of space where, because you're right, it's 5 to 7 years, and part of that is because the changes that are implemented in a farm bill take a couple of years to kind of realize, oh, that's not working, right? And so you need a little bit of time. But I think finding spaces, whether it's in the Progressive Caucus, whether it's in some other new venue, whether it's in something totally different, where members can have that, see the connections to the farm bill every year rather than just once every 5 years. So looking for those spaces.
I think there are a lot of different spaces you can work here, and it's not just look at the 12 titles of the bill, or your boss cares about crop insurance or something like that, which Ron kind of already covers. But does your boss care about climate change? Well, then your boss can get involved in improving soil health, or in reducing funding for capos and big industrial feedlots for animals that emit methane into the atmosphere. Does your boss care about farm worker labor? Does he want a title for to fight for a title that actually improves labor conditions in farms? Does your boss care about, healthy food, and does she want to make sure that she's working on protecting Finney or even expanding it, or improving the LAMP program that helps small farmers. So I think when you dig into it, there will be different areas that you can do, and you'll find that, oh my God, there are only a couple kind of progressive Democrats that care about the Farm Bill,
Right.
and we have to do a lot of lifting to fight for the things we care about. And so we welcome your voices, we welcome your boss's participation. My boss does events like this at home all the time, and for a district that is Portland, Oregon, and like super urban, we actually get some really good turnout and some really good events. And he's also done traveling to other districts and had really, really cool conversations. And got a surprising amount of people that want to see it again, like crazy dude like pie and a bow tie talking about farming. We're going to do more working group meetings like we did for the last Farm Bill. We want to get all the new members that don't really know these issues that well and want to learn about them and want to find things to work on there. And then as Dan mentioned before, there are plenty of opportunities within the next 5 years to engage. There are appropriations letters that get sent around. There are changes in disaster supplementals or in budgets that get put out there that we are going to need to fight for or fight against. And the best way to keep in touch and to find a space that your boss can work in is to contact myself, to talk to Mike, and to sign up on our mailing list to attend those meetings, and we'll work with you guys, because I have a ton of ideas that are sitting on my shelf that either haven't made it to bill form or haven't been introduced or could be divvied up, and I'm happy to give them to people to fight for.
I will make this is a really good question, and I will make one more plug for the book. And the last chapter is 25 things that need to happen. But in one of the last chapters talks about a 50-year farm bill. So there's a white paper that you can find on the web out of the Land Institute. We have someone from the Berry Center here today, Wendell Berry, one of our incredible conservation agrarian authors, leaders, was also involved in these brainstorming sessions, and their idea was exactly what you've said. We shouldn't be looking at farm policy in 5-year chunks, because changes take place over a generation, and instead we should be looking 50 years out to what kind of agriculture system do we have to get to. I thought the green on the fields was a very visual description of where we have to go. We have to have a lot more green in the fields and get away from this export annual driven commodity agriculture, but it's not going to take place overnight, so we have to look 50 years out. There's a really excellent plan by some of our best thinkers that they kind of laid out a map, and each 5 years can be seen as an investment opportunity and then a way to look how far are we going toward that goal of really sustainable agriculture, which is obviously going to be changing as the climate heats up and all kinds of other issues arise. But I would highly recommend looking up the 50-year Farm Bill, and there's a great paper there. Thank you guys for coming.
Yes, thank you.